So we have, hello, Juliet, hello, Safia, Penny. It's so lovely to have you here. And I really have a lot of respect and admiration for your work. As a woman, as a resident, as a mom, and now as an elected member, because I've seen from the outside the impact of your passion and the work that you put in. Some for decades, some for a number of years, and it comes from a place of love and care. I am going to start by just asking if you have any reflections on what Diane was saying earlier, what has been said so far. And you all have between, up to 10 minutes if you want to present and share what you want to share. I think we're going to start with you, Safia, then Miss Juliet, and then Penny. And then we're going to leave a bit of time at the end for questions and answers. As you see, we have a very engaged audience and very keen to ask and contribute. Welcome, Penny. Welcome, Juliet and Safia. Really great having you here today.
Thank you.
We're going to get started with you, Safia, if that's okay.
Absolutely fine. Well, hi, everyone. Such a powerful discussion with Diane Abbott and I guess the discussion that followed thereafter. But I think it's important that we do have data, but we also have lived experience. And what really stood out for me is that she made it quite clear that it was a social justice issue that we're facing here. And also what was really powerful to hear is when she ended with, we might as well give young people a date to turn up to prison. And that's why we're here. We know that, I guess, the individual cases that we all deal with in our capacity is massive and huge, but actually there's a wider systematic issue that as a society, we need to make sure that we're collectively approaching, but we know that it exists and there's no self-defense. You know, a lot of schools go into self-defense saying we haven't got an issue, it's the individual child. Well, no, actually it's really important to say it's not the individual, but rather the system that's not working for young Black kids. So a little bit just from me, I grew up in East London, primary school, secondary school. I deliver mental health training courses, assist in mental health first aid, which is about suicide intervention. I always bring in the cultural nuances because I think it's so important, whatever work that you're doing, that you understand the culture and the diversity and also all Black people aren't the same, you know, all Muslim people aren't the same. There's diversity that comes with that. And it's really important for us to embrace that and understand that. I also have been for over 8 years an independent police advisor. And so the criminal justice system that our young kids disproportionately affected. I've always said actually what happens in school is so important, what happens to children in post-school. So the trust, the lack of trust that they have with stakeholders, people in positions of power. If trust is broken in the school, it means the children and young people will see the system against them. And I really think that really is connected to a lot of criminal justice and other inequalities, mental health and so on that our young kids face. And my main role is a CEO of a women's organisation based in East London that supports Black and ethnic minority women, especially Somali-led charity. And actually being a women's organisation, we do a number of services. Now, it's founded by, Women's Inclusive Team is founded by women, Black women, and it's used as a tool to solve problems, whether it's health inequalities, because Black community is disproportionately affected by health inequalities, socioeconomically, and, you know, domestic abuse and so on and so forth. And it's really important to note that. And we saw what happened in COVID, and we talk about health inequalities, we talk about life and death. And I really think that a lot of our children have inherited secondhand trauma and challenges that their families have faced. So it's really important to kind of note that as well. What really hurt is the what Diane Abbott said in regards to people that are on low income, socially excluded, I guess, disadvantaged communities being disproportionately affected by exclusion. And adding that to, I guess, the other challenges and that I've said in terms of that wider picture, because it's important that we don't just look at one issue, that we understand the bigger issue. That was really important. So for me, some of the work that we've done, and we've done work around schools, it's often been when there's an emergency, when relationships has broken down, when something's happened, when a child is excluded, we go into schools and we support them in trying to navigate the complaint process, trying to mediate between the school and the family. But in during COVID, I think the nation or the society around the world has opened up, and I think a lot of people that didn't know there was inequalities suddenly realized that there were huge inequalities in different areas. So we did a piece of work with Bernardo's, which is a children's charity, well known and respected, around inequality, specifically around discrimination with Somali children. And in that, 251 young people were interviewed, and the survey really came up with some really shocking information, which really highlighted how young people felt around being treated differently in the school, how a lot of them felt that they've had the N-word called in their school disproportionately, shocking. And also, I think it also really highlighted the idea that, brown people and black people, there are tension and issues between them. And that was a very interesting piece of work that we looked at. But most importantly, young kids over and over said that they felt treated differently by teachers compared to their peers. And that's a horrible place to be in, whether true or not, the feeling of feeling unjustly done or differently treated differently as a result of your heritage or your skin color is a huge impact on young people. I think some of the work that we look at is the layers. So there's layers, being Muslim, being black, being ethnic minority. There is layers of inequalities. And a lot of the work that we do is we try and really tackle, what does representation look like? Representation is really important in all platforms and work settings. And sadly, in schools, when we look at senior management, for example, very, very rarely does one see diversity in that. And that's really important for us to know that. Just like the police were working towards representation, schools need to also be geared and working towards that, because that's how you make sure that trust has been broken between families and schools needs to be repaired. So people that look like you. And also, I think what for Bernardo's, what came out, that piece of work that we did, is trauma. We underestimate trauma. In fact, the black community and ethnic minority community don't fully understand the impact of trauma, but we know trauma has a huge impact on a young person's life. And hearing a group of sixth formers, and it was a steering group that was done, literally crying and saying that they felt the experience that they had from year 7 to year 11 made them, wanting to move out of the area, wanting to hold their school to account. And that's at a point where they've had a voice and they can articulate a little bit better. So what happens to year 7? And they were talking about experience that they had throughout the whole year. So I think that's really important for us to note and understand that. I think the work the young people, ultimately, that's what we're looking at, is how do we make sure that young people that have the experience that they have in school doesn't damage them emotionally, psychologically, and makes them be in the very best position. But what work that we've done, and we've done an SEND program, and that came up a lot this morning. Often children or young black kids are being labelled as having behavioural issues. Well, we know that the issue is not behavioural issues. It's SCND or special needs or other underlying issues that hasn't been diagnosed. Now, sadly, misdiagnosis is, whether we like it or not, we all have a window of the world. We're all biased to an extent. And I think it's really important for schools to understand that there's bias and they come in with that. And a lot of like I said, a lot of the team members don't reflect the local community. But that has a huge impact. And it also, because the trust is broken, when a school does ask sometimes for parents to have their children assessed, parents say no, because it's become a negative, unhealthy relationship where they don't want their children to be assessed. And so therefore, it leaves a young person in a very vulnerable position. I think what I really want to say, and just to echo what the MP said, is that actually when we talk about many other campaigns, whether it's domestic abuse or mental health, we always say that it's everyone's problem. And actually, this is everyone's issue. It's not just the school's issue. It's not just the family's issue. It's everyone's business to make sure that, that our society, our future children, are nourished and nurtured and developed, and they reach their potential, whatever that looks like for them. And so for me, what I would love to see, just to kind of conclude on that, is transparency from schools, where schools are forced, it's compulsory for them to share data around exclusion, and that we as a community are able to see that data, see where schools are, and schools are able to then improve. Because I do think there is a culture where things are brushed under the carpet and there's too much power that's given to schools and things stay within their control. So how do we make sure local authorities hold school to account, that we can have access to that data? I also think there needs to be an independent supporter within schools that's not a part of the school but has access to the school. And we've done that as a result of the work that we did with Barnardo's, where we have Somali welfare officers that are based in schools, where they can not wait for things to escalate, where it becomes exclusion, where they can actually really do a lot of prevention within the school. Because often when someone comes in, it's where there's a problem. So how do we make sure that it doesn't reach that point? So independent support within the school is really important. And I also think an independent campaign similar to the one that's been mentioned is super, super important. How do we mobilize ourselves? How do we make sure we resource that well? Because when we resource that really well, we then have the ability to fight, to challenge, to push, to go the extra mile. And again, just to kind of go back to what Diane said, is that actually if children, we know that this is having a massive impact on the children's future, I guess, future achievements, then we need to do something about it now. So I'll stop there for a moment. Thank you.
Safia, so powerful. Thank you so much. There are a number of points that you've made, and thank you for sharing what you have, what your organization has been doing with parents and the findings that you've had. There's something around the transparency from the schools that you mentioned that is so key, and I'm really pleased that you mentioned data, because it's one of the things that, as myself as a parent, I have found that is one of the loopholes in the system and the inaccuracies. And also it leads to the misunderstanding of that behavior issue that young person might have, when actually it's not behavior, but actually it is potentially a special need that is unnoticed and is invisible. Thank you so much for that, Safia. We're gonna come back to questions and answers in a bit, and I'm sure that there are already comments being made in the chat, and we're gonna bring again the audience and the community together. We're gonna hear now from Juliet, a colleague, who will speak to us about precisely this something that Safia mentions about, the parent-child relationship with the schools. You have so much experience on this topic, Juliet. Thank you for being here today. Really keen to hear what you're going to share with us. I learned a lot from you, so thank you for being here today. I think you muted it still, Juliet.
Cardinal sin.
There you go.
Thank you, Councillor. Welcome everybody this morning. It's a privilege to be invited here to share some stories and some experience. Just a little bit about me. I'm Juliet. I was born and educated in Hackney. I grew up on the local council estate from a single parent family, and school for me was the best years of my life. My teachers were kind. They allowed me to dream big. And when I retired back in 2019, I tracked down my primary school teacher. I kind of felt it was so important because I retired due to ill health. And I thought, before I pass on, I want to tell her thank you. And I saw her for the first time last year after 50 years to say thank you, because I recognize, after being a teacher and seeing now post-retirement what schools are like, how fortunate I was. I taught in a school for over 20 years and became a senior deputy head. I led on Ofsted. We were Ofsted Outstanding, and we were a school that was in the heart of Tottenham, rough, but we found ways in which to make it successful. I led, I said before, on Ofsted. We were 3 consecutive occasions we were outstanding. But most importantly, I led on a subject called citizenship, which was helping the students to be active citizens. And I led on community campaigns. And one of them, where the students led on it, earned the school a Queen's Award, which is an equivalent to an MBE. We were so passionate that we ensured that no child left school, if they didn't achieve academically, they were going to be well-rounded citizens. And I think that has kept me, passionate about when I think about schools today. I mean, my school worked on the premise that there was no need to exclude. Of course, if a staff member was at risk, if a child's at risk, fair enough, we'd have to sort alternative means. But it was the last resort as far as we were concerned. And I remember before I retired, I worked on a project which was creating an alumni wall. I wanted the students to see where other students had gone on to and what they had, what they had achieved post leaving school, because not everybody was academic. And I remember quite a few students that I was putting up on this wall that would have been excluded for persistent disruptive behavior. There was a guy called Emmanuel who wasn't interested in any kind of lessons apart from PE. And Emmanuel ended up being a footballer for Arsenal, Emmanuel Frimpong. I remember a guy called Chip, who was actually going to be permanently excluded from his school in the borough, and we accepted him as a managed move, right? He ended up as #2 in the national charts, a pop singer. His name's Chipmunk. I remember a guy called Elijah. He wasn't academic. He loved food, especially chicken. And he took part in lots of extracurricular activities that included debating and other bits and pieces. And I sat at home one Friday night, turned on the TV, on Channel 4. He was a star of this program called Peng Life. He had made a living, or he was a YouTube sensation, grading chicken from 1 to 5 and ended up with a Channel 4 program. And I also remember a guy called Ricky. He was very cheeky, always answered back. In this day and age, he'd have been excluded for persistent disruptive behavior. But after I left school, I ended up having a heart attack, which is why I retired due to ill health. I got a message from him through Facebook saying that he's a cardiovascular surgeon at the Royal Brompton Hospital. Would I like him to do my surgery? Now, these are children that would have been written off. And I'm just making the point to say that, there isn't a need to exclude. We have to find ways and means of intervening early and supporting those children and those parents. I think the first thing in terms of parents, what we need to do is support them in selecting the right school for their child. Some schools have a one-size-fits-all policy, and it doesn't work for all children. So where children are different culturally or neurodiverse and respond and learn in different ways, a school with fantastic outcomes may not be the best fit. So lots of parents will put that school #1 on their list, but they don't understand the school's behavior policy or the student code of conduct. And they need, I guess, if it's primary school, help and support from the local authority, or if it's a primary school, who knows that child should be able to communicate with the parents to see if that secondary school is best fit for them. And there should be a year 6 into year 7, transition program that should also help the child and parent. I worked with a pupil where the parent had to fight for an EHC plan assessment and was waiting for an ADHD diagnosis when she was permanently excluded. She tried to kill herself twice because she didn't want to be away from her friends. Her mother was a single parent. English was her second language. I think Claudia mentioned that when the child was excluded, the school sent a 290-page document that she couldn't even read, with all the infractions and all the bits and pieces that she didn't understand. Where was her support? How was she going to get support for her daughter? She also had other children. So that had a massive impact on her family. I think early intervention is key. And after the shock of a first exclusion, which is probably a persistent disruptive behavior infraction, like talking the line or, answering back or not putting your hand up, it doesn't feel serious until that parent and that child is in the last chance saloon. So as soon as that first letter hits the doorstep, a pastoral support plan to be put in place. I mean, many parents don't know that 45 days in 1 year, no matter if you've changed schools, can lead to your child being removed permanently. So those are the things that need to be considered. I spoke to a young man who came from a single parent family. His mum had mental health issues. She worked full time and couldn't afford to take time off work. His sister was in a primary school setting, and constantly getting excluded for minor infractions. And the school threatened to permanently exclude her if the mum didn't off-roller or accept a managed move. Now, the LA doesn't control all of this, but where does she go? Where does she get support from? When I helped the family with the daughter who was permanently excluded, I remember going to Coram, which is at the end of each exclusion letter where you can get legal advice and stuff. But my experience was they didn't have the capacity to support the family, and they were working with children who had been excluded and who are under local authority care. So where does the help come from? You know, especially if these schools are academies and the local authority can't intervene. You know, following the Child Q incident, I heard Professor Gus Johns say that parents should form parent groups in each school. And it's there you'll realize you have more in common and can collectively challenge. So it's important that, you know, parents get together and take control. You are the stakeholders. And I sometimes feel quite surprised that parents are the ones that are unempowered. They're the ones that don't have the power, the ones that, you know, are being done to, as it were, when sometimes maybe there's an opportunity to flip the script and for them to take control. I think it's important to connect with a VCS organization in the borough. I mean, I'm a director of a social enterprise that runs monthly drop-ins and support families in the Hackney community and signpost parents to help and support. I mean, I would recommend that as a parent, you don't ignore the fixed term exclusions. You know, sometimes, you know, your child gets excluded for persistent disruptive behavior, and it doesn't seem a big deal until you get that final letter that leads to the permanent exclusion. I would recommend they challenge where necessary. It's maybe in writing, a letter to the head teacher, copying it into the chair of governors and the head of the disciplinary committee. You know, put your concerns in writing. So when the exclusion pack is produced, your letters are also included in that, because you've explained that you're not happy about this or you're challenging that. Write everything down. You know, the calls the school makes, the conversations you have, because a lot of the times those things are missing when it comes to that exclusion meeting. And make sure all the actions that are suggested in the meeting are put in the letter that you get back and are followed up. Because I found with the exclusion meetings that I sat in on, right, the parent would say, oh, but you said you'd do this. But it wasn't in the letter when they said that. It wasn't followed up if it was in the letter. So at least you have some power to challenge. And also, you know, follow the school's complaints procedure, because only after that is done, you can write a letter of complaint to the cabinet member in your local council responsible for schools and young people. Because what they normally say is, oh, have you followed the school's disciplinary procedure, before they can actually intervene. So those are just a few things I just want to leave with you, basically. Yeah.
Juliet, thank you so much. A lot of ideas in the head, and I can see hearts in the room. Thank you so much. You have such ability to share the experiences of young people in the work that you've done. It sounds so inspirational, as you said. If those children and young people would have been under this system where there's such a punitive system, they would have probably not got to where they got into. So it's really important that you say and bring this in. Now, the point that you make about, as we go now to our next panelist, about the importance of parents putting on record all of the issues that are happening with the children in terms of suspensions, and how actually when you just let go that suspension, I remember I've seen my own kid that has 60 suspensions, and then you think, well, it's so normalized, so little bits and bobs, but actually then it becomes a permanent exclusion. You talk about the importance of raising that. Now we're going to hear now from Penny, and actually after when we hear from Penny, then we're going to see as the panel whether also you have questions for each other and you want to talk to each other about this, and also bring maybe comments from the audience. But just as we go now to Penny, actually it's a perfect way to introducing you, Penny. Welcome here, and it's so great to have you. One of my favorite colleagues in the council, I might say. We're both councillors in the same ward. Penny, we heard from Juliet. You've been leading on this topic in actually the fact that when we parents follow exclusion policies, the complaint procedures, nothing happens. And it'll be good to hear from you. I'll leave you there. Thank you for being here, Penny, and we're really keen to hear from you.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful to be here. And also, I just want to thank Safia and Juliet for the bloody brilliant work they do in East London, because I know they both do. Thank you. I'm going to speak a little bit about personal experience of my own, and as a parent and also as a counsellor and campaigner, with a view to trying to illustrate it to illustrate some of the structural problems that we've got. Because I can't remember who it was, Esther, I think, who was talking about how we need education reform. We absolutely do need education reform, but it's not going to happen as a revolution. It will happen in a kind of incremental way. So I think we have to start to block out what some of those footsteps might be on the path to education reform. And I hope that what I say will help to inform that debate a little bit. So I'm going to tell you a personal story for a start about my daughter, who when she was in year 12, sorry, not year 12, year 8, was at school and was being bullied quite badly, and it was starting to have quite a big effect on her mental health. And we talked to her about it, and she absolutely did not want any intervention at school, because she knew that the first thing the school would do would be to go to talk to the bullies, and that she would end up being bullied even more. So we looked online and for some advice, and one of the things that we found really distressing as parents was that most of the online advice very quickly started talking about suicide prevention. And so we were alarmed, I suppose, at how quickly things seemed to ratchet up towards suicide prevention. And certainly it put us off suggesting to her that she looked online for any helpful solutions, because we didn't want to put those ideas in her head. So that was one issue that was difficult for us. Anyway, in the end, we decided we would go to the school, we would talk to the school, but we wouldn't name the bullies. We would, and the idea really was keep an eye open, see what's going on, see how you can intervene, but we're not going to tell you who the bullies are. So what happened was, of course, the school knew exactly who the bullies were. And of course, the school went straight off to talk to the bullies. Didn't name our daughter, but instead the bullies thought that another girl had gone, her parents had gone. And my daughter came back from school the next day saying, poor Maddie's having such a terrible time because her parents must have gone to the school because the school's been pulled out the bullies and blah, 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 blah. And what that taught me was that schools are primarily interested in the interests of the schools. And that's a really important lesson for parents to learn, because I think, yes, they will advertise lots of health policies, etc., but always remember that it's the school's reputation which is the most important thing to the school. So that's a sort of a beginning. Fast forward a bit, and I become a local counsellor, and there is a school near us in our ward. I live near it, called Mossbourne Academy. And I was approached as a counsellor by some parents whose son was suffering from really severe anxiety. They were really beside themselves. He did have a health education and care plan, and the school, which asked the school to do certain things, and the school was essentially taking no notice of it, and they were pushing him through on this idea of no excuses, no exceptions in their behaviour policy. That was their mantra: no excuses, no exceptions. And they pushed this boy to such a degree that he was physically ill with his anxiety, and his parents were desperate. They ended up paying £2,000 to start a tribunal case. Now, you know, there aren't that many people who've got the money to start tribunal cases. So this is partly where some of the systemic discrimination starts to kick in, because how can you go to a tribunal if you can't even start it because you haven't got the money to kick off with? Anyway, they did invest in that, but they also didn't have really that much money to want to follow the whole thing through. And they really just wanted to get him to the end of his GCSE year so that he could start his life again. And so they came to me, and I offered to represent them in a sort of last-ditch appeal hearing with the school. And this was, for me, an extraordinary eye-opener, really, because it was an incredibly formal setting. The parents and me on one side, and all these other people sitting in like a sort of like a courtroom sort of scenario. It was incredibly intimidating, even for me, who's not easily intimidated. And at the end of it, we basically got them, because they didn't want to go to tribunal either, because it doesn't look good. We got them to agree to a sort of a plan to get him through, to allow him to reduce the number of GCSEs that they were forcing him to take, and to try and help him to get through school to the end of his year. Unfortunately, they didn't stick to it. You know, they just didn't stick to it. And he ended up with no GCSEs, and you know, is still to this day a very unhappy young man, even though he's now in his 20s. It was shocking. Periodically after that, I would receive other complaints about this school. About a year ago, I got one from a family who said that their daughter was being forbidden from going to the prom because she'd been late for school one morning. I mean, talk about disproportionate, you know, and she was devastated. I wrote to the school, and this is what tended to happen because it is an academy, obviously. I wrote to the school putting the case for, please, could you reconsider this prom idea? And I rarely got a letter back, but on this occasion, I got a letter back saying our behavior policies are strict and proportionate, and we no exceptions. So then what happened, which is a really positive thing, and this is where parent power comes in, but again, it speaks of how class privilege makes all the difference. I got a visit from a very definitely white middle class parent who had taken his son out of school because of, basically, he'd been doing fine. Then COVID had happened, he'd got long COVID, and the school had refused to make any kind of special provision, despite the fact that the doctors were telling them what to do. And so he fought with the school, went through all the complaints procedures very rigorously, got nowhere. School wouldn't do anything. In the end, they took him out of school to try and help him to get through his GCSEs, and they had the resources to be able to pay for private tuition. But in the process of doing this chap whose name is Andy, Claudia and Juliet both know him, he spoke to lots of other parents, realized that lots of other parents weren't in the sort of circumstances that he was in, and realized that this actually was a big problem, that a lot of this is all linked to the over-rigorous enforcement of very poor behavior policies, and also frankly, the abuse of complaints procedures as well, which are just hardly fit for purpose and which can be manipulated by so many of the schools. So he got the parents together and he wrote up their testimonies, and he had 30 testimonies from parents. And then he came to me and we said, right, let's go to the local authority to see what the local authority can do about this. Basically, the local authority sat on it for 6 months and did nothing. So at that point, we decided that it was we'd go to the press. So we went to the press, and when we went to the press, instead of having 30 testimonies, we very quickly ended up with 300 testimonies. And those testimonies were not just coming from parents of pupils, they were coming from the pupils themselves who'd left, who were now young adults, who wanted to talk about how badly they'd been impacted by what had happened. And also, and we were perhaps most surprised by that, quite a lot came from the teachers who had been forced to implement these horrible policies and were finding that their bonuses and their references and what have you were being impacted by whether or not they were prepared to be super strict or not. So anyway, we at this point had understood that local authorities basically have very limited powers to intervene with academies. The way that the structures work with academies is that basically you complain to the school, you try to go through their complaints procedures, you end up going to the governors. If the governors ignore you, at that point, basically you go to the Department for Education. So you then you jump from a very local organization of governors to this huge organization, Department for Education. And you know, there's very little in the middle there. It seems to me it's very important there should be something in the middle there, because you know, you're looking at moving from board of governors who are doing it on a voluntary basis to a huge government national department. It's ridiculous that there's nothing in between. So that's one of the structural things that needs to change. But what we did discover was that local authorities, if they have concerns about child safeguarding, can institute something called a local child safeguarding review. And to the best of our knowledge, this had only ever been done if there was concern about one particular child or perhaps a family in certain extreme circumstances. It was not something that had ever been used to look at something where there was systemic abuse, if you like, where there's a systemic abuse over an extended period of time. And we thought that this was a tool that actually the local authority probably could use to have a local child safeguarding review if we could present them with enough information. So once we got our 300 testimonies, we went back to the local authority and said, you really can't ignore this. We did have help from a national newspaper to help us to publicize it. So the council was afraid about what would happen if they did ignore it. And we have got that child safeguarding review now, which is great. I have to say, and I've noticed that people have been on the chat talking about money. I do suspect that part of the reason why there wasn't a child safeguarding review earlier is because they're expensive. And the local authority is strapped for cash, and that is a disincentive to doing this kind of thing. Anyway, as that goes on, a couple of other things I want to just mention. One is that there is the child wellbeing bill going through Parliament as we speak at the moment. That potentially has the opportunity to address this issue, this safeguarding gap that there is in academies in particular. But unfortunately, despite contacting various politicians about it, including the Secretary of State, I don't think there's any real appetite for addressing that at the moment with the Labour Party. I think that's something we're going to have to fight for again, but Labour are here for a while, and I'm sure this won't be the only education bill, so we'll get a second bite at that cherry, I'm sure. And the other thing I wanted to just talk about was the regulatory system, because we've talked a bit about Ofsted, but actually Ofsted, so much of what Ofsted does is a paper exercise. It's about coming in at looking at policies, and are the policies right, and are they saying all the right things? There's very little scope for further investigation to see if those policies are actually being implemented properly, particularly when it comes to safeguarding concerns. And I would say that Ofsted don't have the tools to check on safeguarding properly. The people who do have those tools are local authorities and local health authorities, because there you're dealing with social workers and health workers and mental health workers who know what questions to ask, who know how to do the investigations. So I think that potentially trying to shift those safeguarding investigations away from Ofsted towards authorities which have got the resources and the expertise to do them properly at a local level would be something that was worth campaigning for. And the other thing I just wanted to talk about just briefly, sorry, I'm talking for too long, but briefly, I just want to talk about the market system, because we now have more secondary schools or academies in this country than they are run by local authorities. And what that means is that we've got schools running in a market system. The schools basically are private companies using public money to deliver a service, a public service. And that means that they're in competition with each other. And that means that they're obviously trying to portray themselves as being the best at everything. And it is certainly true that in some of these academies, and certainly Mossbourne was one of them, their academic standards went up. So if you're only using the measuring stick of exam results, Mossbourne looks fabulous. But if you're looking at the measuring stick of long-term well-being, of happiness, it looks very, very different. And just finally, even though this is a market system, it's a really unfair playing field, because these academies are not obliged to publish any of their stats on things like detentions, suspensions, exclusions. Indeed, it's really difficult to dig those figures out. The Department for Education has them, but they're all coded. You have to understand how the codes are to know which schools you're talking about. So if I'm a parent trying to decide where to send my child to school, how do I make a decision about whether or not their behavior policy is going to damage my sensitive child or not? It's really difficult to do. So that has partly polarized the debate as well, because there are some parents who are so keen to get their kids to have the right exam results that they will defend schools for these very harsh behavior policy regimes, because they think that's how they're going to get the academic results. And indeed, one of the things that Claudia knows, that there's been quite a big backlash towards those of us who've been campaigning for the child safeguarding review, from parents who say, well, my child's all right, you can't please all the children, and you know, they and look at what they've done for exam results. So, you know, it's a complicated thing, but I think we seriously have to look at taking apart that marketized model that we've got for education at the moment. And, you know, personally, the health service has been talking about person-centered care for the last decade. It's time that we talked about person-centered education within schools as well. So everybody can recognize that we're dealing with individuals here, not just people who've all got to obey the same system. Okay.
Absolutely, Penny. Thank you so much.
And listening to me.
You ran over time, but it was very important that you did. Thank you. Everything you brought in was hugely, hugely important. Thank you. And actually, what your last message it speaks to the campaign that we want to launch here. We're launching today about that person-centered approach and care. And we only have now a few more minutes before we wrap up for a break. I think it's been a very emotionally charged as well, because the examples that we're talking about brings emotions. And Safia, you spoke very powerfully as to what you're doing within your communities, Juliet, the years of experience and what you've seen that has happened to young people. And, you know, Penny, you are brilliant at pushing for change. I see it, you're my colleague, but I also wanted to say, the work that you're doing is also because we are now able to be independent and bring topics that perhaps local authorities don't always want to approach because they don't want to kind of break a party line. And it's also, I think, important to say that. Just as before we go into a break, and I think John will come in maybe to explain about the break. Before we do that, is there any final thoughts that you might want to share with each other? I think there's some comments in the chat as well, but I just wanted to invite you and open the room for you guys to, Safia, Julian, and Penny, maybe you might want to comment on each other. Just bearing in mind that soon we're going to go to break.
If I can just come in and say that was really powerful to hear both of you and the work that you've done. And I know that we spoke about a specific school, Mosbourne, specifically, but just to say it isn't just them. But I also believe, but it's good to use an example for a school for us to kind of navigate and understand the issues and challenges. But I also found it interesting when I was reading all those articles, and actually because the young people and the families that were affected weren't from global majorities, most of them, I think they were able to articulate. It goes back to what colleagues were saying before about parents not having, Julia, not having the skills to be able to fight the process. And these families were able to articulate, and I guess newspapers digest and appreciate stories like that, so they can therefore push it because the readers want to read about people that. So I think there is a deeper issue here, I think, and actually some of those schools that it's Black and ethnic minority children are experiencing aren't often told. So it's layers, isn't it? Layers for all kids that face inequalities, but actually from a global majority, the challenge is even harder. But actually, you know, external stakeholders don't pick it up and aren't able to capture that. So I found that really interesting. So really appreciate both of your input there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Safia. And Juliet, was there anything you wanted to say before we go to break? And
Not really. Is my mic off?
no, we can hear
Sorry,
you. We can hear
really.
you.
I think that Safia and Penny have covered it all. So thank you, colleagues, for sharing this platform.
Thank you. Any
Thank
last
you.
thoughts, Claudia, before we go to break? And
Yes, sorry. No. This has been a really wonderful panel. Thank you very much. I think clearly there is a lot of input, a lot of action happening. There's a lot of strength of feelings. I can see a lot of hands up, unfortunately, because it was important to hear everything that was said. We'll come back to when we have more opportunities through the rest of the conference. Juliet, Safia, Penny, muchas gracias. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have you today.